I'm Frank Sesno. Welcome to this special presentation of the History Channel. Last fall, to mark the 40th anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, this network aired a series of independently produced programs that examined numerous conspiracy theories. They included the alleged involvement of Fidel Castro, the Mafia, and the CIA. One of the programs accused President Lyndon Johnson of being directly involved in the assassination. It was called The Guilty Men, and after it was televised, the History Channel came under criticism for the program's controversial allegations and one-sided presentation. In the interest of fairness and accuracy, the History Channel asked 3 historians to view the program and report on its credibility. They are totally independent from one another and from the History Channel, as am I. They are free to offer any opinions and observations they feel are warranted, and they're here to talk about their findings. Thomas Segrue is bicentennial class of 1940 professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania, an expert on 20th century American political and social history. Professor Segrue's first book, The Origins of Urban Crisis, won several major awards, including the Bancroft Prize for Best Book in American History. He's written extensively on a wide range of topics, including the history of liberalism and conservatism, America in the 1950s and 1960s, the politics of affirmative action, and on urban and public policy. Stanley Kutler is professor of history and law at the University of Wisconsin. He's the author of more than 10 books, including The Wars of Watergate, Privilege and Creative Destruction, and The American Inquisition, winner of the American Bar Association's Silver Gavel Award. He successfully sued to release the Nixon White House tapes in 1996. And Professor Robert Dallek has taught American history at Columbia University, UCLA, Oxford, and the University of Texas, and most recently at Boston University. He's the author of 8 books, including Hail to the Chief, The Making and Unmaking of American Presidents, Flawed Giant, Lyndon Johnson and His Times, 1961 to 1973, An Unfinished Life, John F. Kennedy, 1917 to 1963, and Lyndon B. Johnson, Portrait of a President. He's the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards and is currently president of the Society of American Historians. Gentlemen, welcome to you. Thanks very much for coming in for this important conversation. We will get to the guts of this controversial documentary in a moment, but to lay the ground and set the landscape a little bit, conspiracy theories continue to persist on this assassination that took place more than 40 years ago. Why is that, Thomas Segrue?
Well, John F. Kennedy occupied a larger-than-life position in America in the early 1960s, and his assassination, inexplicable, came at a critical juncture when American politics were taking a turn. Folks look back at John F. Kennedy and see on him a blank slate. They project on him the what-if question. What if Kennedy hadn't been assassinated? Where would America go? So the assassination in this picture, in other words, takes on a meaning that goes well beyond the events in November 1963.
How does the what-if question lead to all these conspiracy theories, though? And they continue to linger, don't they?
They do. I agree with everything Tom said, but just to take a little step beyond that, we all love a mystery. We love conspiracies more. The idea that one man could have pulled this off is almost incomprehensible to most people. But the idea that there had to be some network of people who had ulterior motives, that's a very appealing idea. Look at the business with Princess Diane. When we think that Americans love a conspiracy theory, you got the French and the English very, very happy with this whole notion that there was some big plot to do her in, whether it was her ex-husband, the royal family, or who knows what. So this idea that one person should have pulled this off is incomprehensible.
Bob Dallek?
Well, I think people are so uncomfortable with the idea that someone as inconsequential as Oswald could have killed someone as consequential as Kennedy. I think it gives people comfort to think that there was some larger design here, some larger order, some larger purpose.
Gives people comfort to think that?
I think so. Because,
how's that?
Well, because the world is too chaotic. If just this one man, this inconsequential figure, this dysfunctional character, Oswald, how could he have killed Kennedy? Kennedy, the President of the United States, surrounded by Secret Service. How could this guy have done it? So it leaves the world too shattered, too endangered, so to speak, to think that he was the sole killer.
The numbers are really quite remarkable when you ask Americans what they actually believe. 3/4 of Americans do still to this day believe that more than one person was involved. Is that surprising?
Well, no, it's not, because
I mean, that's
we
more than
have-
conspiracy theories.
No,
That's the public saying, we don't believe
Right.
the prevailing explanation.
But the public represents consumers of an industry that has proliferated in this country over the last 40 years, this industry of conspiracy theories. And people, more and more is said about it. There are less and less answers to them. People are able to project these things. They have, as I say, a veritable industry going with all kinds of newsletters, websites, and so forth. And to people, the more distant that people are from the event, that is the younger people, are more inclined to believe this. I was appalled a few years ago when I suddenly discovered that my students had seen the Oliver Stone movie of JFK and believed it whole.
But Frank, what it speaks to, I think, also is the the extraordinary cynicism about politics in this country. They don't believe their leaders. They don't trust what the government says. They think behind every action of the government, there's some kind of, not every action, obviously, but so many of the actions. They see conspiracies, they see skullduggery, they see manipulation. And they're not totally, it's not totally false.
And interestingly, many contemporary and contemporaneous historians will start that, will track that to the assassination of Kennedy
Yes.
himself.
That's right.
Yes.
I would say also that the conspiracy theories about the Kennedy assassination took root in the fertile soil of anti-government attitudes in the 1960s. Lyndon Johnson had a credibility gap about the Vietnam War. Richard Nixon, of course, added fuel to the fire that there must indeed be darker forces at work deceiving and manipulating the American public.
Let me come back to the numbers, though, on the conspiracy theory and ask you specifically this, because the documentary that we're talking about and are going to be getting into in great substance and detail in just a moment alleges that LBJ was directly involved, that he was behind the murder of JFK. That is explosive. In these polls that are taken, one just by Gallup just last fall, 18% of Americans believe there was an involvement by the then Vice President, subsequently the President.
Well, what lingers here, of course, is Johnson's credibility gap, as Tom says. The Vietnam War, the fact that we were fighting a war which the public came to see as an awful mistake, that the President and his administration was misleading the country as to the worthwhileness of such an enterprise. And Johnson is remembered not for civil rights, not for Medicare, not for federal aid to education, not for the Great Society or the war on poverty, but he seems to be remembered for the skullduggery, the manipulation, the behind-the-scenes operations. And so, you know, this attaches to the Kennedy assassination.
And don't forget that this is all followed by the era of Watergate. So, what I want to suggest to you is that when the Warren Commission report comes out in '65, there are skeptics, disbelievers, critics. But this industry I just spoke of is not yet fully bloomed. But I tell you that as you go on in the years after '65 and you get this confluence of events of Vietnam and LBJ's skullduggery, real and alleged, Nixon's skullduggery, real and alleged, then the percentage who disbelieve what the government has told them in the Warren Commission report rises accordingly.
That's right.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the Warren Commission. We're going to talk about LBJ and the fact that LBJ himself may have believed that there was a conspiracy at work. Right after this. Welcome back. We're discussing America's continued fascination with the Kennedy assassination and the conspiracy theories that continue to endure. We've asked 3 historians to help put this into some historical perspective. And you are here today to talk about this controversial film that aired on the History Channel called The Men Who Killed Kennedy. In that film, one of the lead characters, presented as an authority, a person by the name of Bar McClellan, looks into the camera and he says, "I know beyond a reasonable doubt that Johnson murdered Kennedy." Now, there was a thing called the Warren Commission, which at the time looked hard at this. Was LBJ's name mentioned or ducked? How did it handle any association?
No, they never looked at Lyndon Johnson because they knew that Johnson had nothing to do with
How did they
killing
know that?
Kennedy. Well, because they had plenty of evidence to demonstrate that Lee Harvey Oswald was the sole killer. The Warren Commission, the problem with it is that they did hide things about the failings of the FBI and the Secret Service and the CIA, and that, of course, fanned the flames of suspicion about all this. Now, Johnson himself believed there was a conspiracy. He thought at first it was the Vietnamese retaliating for the killing of Diem during Kennedy's presidency. And then later he thought it was the Cubans. But I had documentary evidence that I used in my study of Johnson's life demonstrating that he had nothing to do with killing Kennedy.
No, I have nothing particular to add to that. I think that Bob brings up the idea of the Warren Commission's vulnerability. And I think that as we really study their workings and see what they did and what they didn't do, it's more the things that they chose to suppress, really.
Such as?
The workings of the Secret Service, the workings of the FBI. Now, the usual argument was made, as I understand it, was that, well, you can't discuss these things because it will reveal sources, it will reveal our techniques and so forth, which is a kind of, guise to maintain secrecy. The fact was that there is a great deal of remorse and guilt within the Secret Service itself. They had failed in their mission. And the question was, are you going to beat them over the head? Was there anything more that they could have done? And the answer is probably not. Probably not. But this notion of conspiracy, they did consider at one point. They raised, some of these matters of foreign conspiracy, and they found nothing. They found nothing.
What was? Go ahead.
I would just add that the Warren Commission report, for all of its flaws, is still the best and most comprehensive study of the Kennedy assassination that we have, and will probably be the best we'll ever have.
What was the role and the profile of Lyndon Johnson during that time, and was he asked any questions during that time?
Well, Johnson was almost hysterical about setting up the Warren Commission. It was absolutely vital, he believed, to have this commission in place, because he was very apprehensive, as he told a number of the people who served on the Warren Commission, that there were suspicions that the Soviets, that the communists, were behind the killing of Kennedy. And he was fearful, as he told Chief Justice Warren, as he told Richard Russell, that this could touch up a war between the United States and the Soviet Union. If people believed that the Soviets were behind the killing of Kennedy, it could lead to a nuclear conflict. And he kept putting pressure on these people to serve on the commission, because he said millions and millions of lives could be at stake. So he was very apprehensive that there could come forward this sort of information.
One of the choices we always have when we do something is not to do something. But in this case, there was no choice not to do anything. Johnson just felt that there had to be some statement made, some explanation.
Well, there would be those, and some in this film who would say that becomes a cover for Lyndon Johnson or others.
I know. I can.
What do you say to that?
Easily anticipate those kinds of answers. I'm just going back to the moment of the creation of the commission. I mean, Johnson is a president by accident. I think that all presidents who have become president by accident are anxious to ensure their legitimacy, their right to succession, if you will. But the country was stunned by this sort of thing. The last time a president had been assassinated was 60-some years before that. I remember my grandfather was an eyewitness to McKinley's assassination, and I once asked him as a young boy, why has no president been assassinated since? And he said, I didn't know I was in training as a historian. He said, well, because the Secret Service now protects the president. And indeed, there was a kind of aura of magic about this. But the Secret Service is composed of human beings who are flawed and will fail from time to time. But it was necessary to have some sort of
Thomas
statement.
Segrue, you're a student of America in the 1960s. At what point do the conspiracy theories start to emerge in a real way? At what point does Lyndon Johnson's name start to get mentioned?
Lyndon Johnson's name shows up relatively early in the wave of conspiracy theories, by 1966, and it's part of a context of growing criticism of Lyndon Johnson publicly. Johnson himself, it should be said, had a very vexed relationship with the news media, and the fact that he was growing in unpopularity because of his foreign policy and because of some of his domestic policies lent fuel to the fire. But the early provenance of these theories about LBJ gives them no credibility.
Frank, you know, Johnson knew he was going to come under suspicion because instantly people would say, well, who's to profit from Kennedy's death? Johnson was an ambitious politician.
Motive, right.
They said, here's a motive. He wanted on that Warren Commission the most distinguished, the most recognizable people in the country, conservatives like a Richard Russell, for example, John J. McCloy. He wanted people like Gerald Ford, because he wanted...
Arlen Specter was on the staff.
Yeah, exactly. People who were going to give a legitimacy to this Warren Commission report. There'll be an excellent book coming out next year by Max Holland, who has studied the Warren Commission to an extent that nobody has done it before. I think it'll be a definitive study of this, and it will express the conclusion that they were right, basically.
That they were right. Now, all three of you are basically saying this. I'm not going to ask for you to speak to the profession, but you know what your colleagues say, and I'm going to put you on the spot. Do most historians agree with you that the Warren Commission is the definitive word?
I think so.
Does it need review?
Yeah, I think so. And
Should the books be reopened?
I think they would add one more statement, picking up on what Bob has said about Max Holland's work, which I'm familiar with it. Indeed, he's a very fine historian. It's a very, very promising work. It won't matter to this industry that exists out there. It won't change their minds. They'll just say it's just another step in the cover-up.
Which brings us to a good place to take a pause, because we're going to look at the details of the conspiracy theory alleged in the men who killed Kennedy, the guilty men, the alleged role of Lyndon Baines Johnson, right after this. I'm Frank Sesno. Welcome back to this special presentation. We're discussing a program which aired on the History Channel that put forth the controversial theory that Lyndon Johnson was involved in the Kennedy assassination. It's been criticized because of its allegations, because of its one-sided presentation. So let's get right to it. To begin with, this documentary, in stating that Lyndon Johnson was behind the assassination, cites several facts. One of them, Bob Dallek, is that LBJ, confidant and protege, Governor Connally of Texas, lured JFK to Texas, where the situation on the ground and elsewhere could be controlled.
As the British say, stuff and nonsense. John F. Kennedy wanted to go to Texas. He was concerned about raising money, about the coming presidential election in 1964. He wanted to go there for political reasons. Connally was resistant to it. He wasn't eager for Kennedy to come there, and Johnson wasn't eager for him to go there either. But it was Kennedy himself who promoted this idea and arranged it.
That Kennedy didn't want to go to Texas, or was reluctant, or that Connally was controlling things. Is this information that you've come across, is this credible?
There's no credible evidence whatsoever that John Connally was involved in the assassination of Kennedy. He was in Texas, but other than that...
of course, he was injured himself.
Right, of course.
What a conspiracy.
Of course he was.
He gets himself shot.
Right.
And the man, the shooter, of course, is as good as the Lone Ranger. He only shoots in the hand. You know, the Lone Ranger never shot anybody to kill him. They just shot his hand, knocked the pistol out.
Let me take on another one. The central voice, and I made reference to Bar McClellan earlier, in this whole thing, says he was told by LBJ's associate, a man by the name of Edward Clark, that he arranged to have Kennedy killed. Who is Edward Clark? Who is Bar McClellan? Who are some of these important characters in this presentation?
Well, Edward Clark was a close associate of Lyndon Johnson's going back to the earliest days of LBJ's career as a congressman in 1937. And he became Lyndon Johnson's ambassador to Australia. I met Clark. I interviewed him. I spent 14 years studying the life and times of Lyndon Johnson. And Clark, Johnson, they may have done many things. They may have cut political corners. Indeed, they did.
Clark was a powerful man.
Powerful man. Johnson was
ruthless.
powerful. And powerful, driven, but the notion that they would kill a sitting president is just simply not credible. I followed the lives, the careers of these men, and I simply found not a hint of evidence that anything like this could have been possible.
Any indication anyplace else is Clark quoted, by anybody else at any time in all the research that you gentlemen have done
No.
that would corroborate this allegation of this documentary?
No.
It's just not, it's not enough to say it's not credible. There is no evidence. Bar McClellan cites as his witnesses and as those who know this. I was very careful. He is, in one respect, a very careful lawyer. He libels only the dead. He brings forth only dead people.
And you can't
with the
libel the
exception.
dead.
And
Right.
let me just point out for the audience that Bar McClellan is a central voice in this documentary we're discussing.
based on
He
his
was
book.
based on his book. He was a lawyer, and himself was disbarred. Is that not correct?
Well, he surrendered
resigned.
his law license.
Okay.
Because he was
Convicted for forgery.
Forgery.
convicted felon.
What do we know about Bar McClellan?
I just told you he's a convicted felon. He was an associate in the firm with Ed Clark. Now it staggers the minds of most people who have been interviewed about this that Ed Clark was going to confide in this young associate at the time. And you know, the film shows you this dark, sinister moment where they cast the camera up at the tower of this building where Ed Clark has a, and there are the dark secrets hidden in the file. You know, I mean, where is it? I mean, there are assertions throughout this film, but there is never a moment of corroboration except that this dead person said that and this dead person said that.
Tom Segrue.
Right. Ultimately, we as historians rely on the credibility of the evidence as presented to us, and a dead man's supposed confession to an associate in a law firm who is himself a felon doesn't stand the test of
Well, let me ask
historical
you.
credibility.
Let me follow up on that to ask you about this allegation and the other that we've talked about. As you watch this film, do you see substantiation for these allegations in the film itself?
No.
No.
Absolutely
No,
not.
that's just it. Except that he said, but there's nothing brought forth. And as I said, it's a history of dead people.
Frank, it's the assertion of authority. They have underneath many of the names, assassination expert. You know, why didn't they come to me, who spent 14 years studying the life of Lyndon Johnson, to at least interview me, to talk to me? Why didn't they come to others who've written contrary things about like Gerald Posner, who's written, I think, the best book called Case Closed on the assassination, who asserts that these conspiracy theories are not convincing. Why don't they go to these people?
I want to talk in a few moments about the responsibility that documentarians, film producers, channels have in these kinds of projects, but to stay on some of the allegations in the documentary itself for just a moment. Another item mentioned in this documentary, which sounds certainly explosive, is that LBJ attended a dinner party at the home of a powerful, influential Texas oilman, Clint Murchison, the night before the assassination. Also in attendance, J. Edgar Hoover, Richard Nixon, and an array of very other powerful men.
I would love to have been at that dinner party.
A fly on the wall.
A fly on the wall.
But it's easy to prove. Either a dinner party happened or it didn't. Did it?
Johnson was in Houston at the time.
Yeah, right. The logs show that he was not there at that time. Let's take one story that's given and just see how we revolve around it. You remember the story of the doctor in the operating room, who that he claims he got a phone call.
Yeah, again, background for the viewers. In the documentary included is a reference to Dr. Crenshaw in the operating room who claims to have gotten a call from LBJ himself as Lee Harvey Oswald is being operated on.
Now, first of all, we've since found out that LBJ wasn't even, he was in the Capitol that day.
Right.
And there was
There are
no,
phones in the Capitol.
huh?
If there are phones in the Capitol, he
No,
could have
but
called
there's no
anybody.
telephone log on this by the Secret Service. There's no log. That's one thing. But first of all, this doctor was holding a bag. He was a very, very junior member of the thing. If he got called out, let's assume he did, and if Lyndon Johnson said, as he is alleged to have said, I want you to get a deathbed confession from Oswald. Well, I thought to myself, well, gee, yeah, that would be great if Oswald said, I did it, and croaked. Wouldn't that have been great? It would have been if he had done it. I'll concede for the sake of argument that he did this. It would seem perfectly normal to me. I don't find anything sinister in it.
So much of this film revolved around, this so-called documentary, revolved around allegations relating to Bobby Baker and Billy Solesnes. Now, I've done Kennedy work, I've done Johnson work. Bobby Kennedy had Lyndon Johnson investigated in 1962-63 to see if there were, the FBI investigated, to see if there were any connection between Johnson and Estes and Bobby Baker in the skullduggery, the transgressions they were both involved in. The Kennedys were worried if they ran again in 64 with Johnson on the ticket and evidence emerged that Johnson was involved in wrongdoing, they didn't want to take any chances. The FBI came back and told Bobby Kennedy Johnson had no connection to either the Bobby Baker or the Estes cases. And this film alleges that he was deeply enmeshed in the wrongdoing of both characters.
Thomas Segrue, again back on the 1960s for just a moment. We know that a man by the name of J. Edgar Hoover was in charge of the FBI since his death, and in the fullness of time, his stature and some of the things he did, people he looked into, have been revealed. Why should, historically speaking, the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover avoid the hot white glare of history's second look?
Why should they avoid the hot white glare of history's second look? Look,
They're always getting it.
right. I mean, the FBI was not essentially involved, at all involved, except for in the investigation of the Kennedy assassination.
And can that investigation be taken at face value?
Well, the FBI conducts its investigations in secrecy, and for reasons of national security, those many of those documents, until historians like Stanley come along to get them open.
Bob Dallek, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, but the allegation that J. Edgar Hoover was somehow behind the assassination of Kennedy is on the face of the
not behind. I wasn't asking about that, but I was asking about in as far as many of theorists are concerned, the FBI cannot be trusted. That the FBI or J. Edgar Hoover may have been involved in some kind of cover-up. What I'm getting at is plenty of people have raised plenty of legitimate questions about J. Edgar Hoover's behavior. Why is that beyond the pale?
Well, the may have been, I think, is ultimately the problematic phrase. That is, may have been, any of us may have been involved in the Kennedy assassination in one way or another, but there's not evidence. And historians ultimately rely on facts.
And let me go to evidence, because you mentioned evidence. In your research, you say you've come up with evidence that LBJ was specifically not involved? What is that?
On the Freedom of Information, I got FBI files. And Johnson, immediately after, within days after Kennedy's killing, he was begging, almost begging, imploring J. Edgar Hoover to assure the safety of himself and his family, because Johnson did not trust the Secret Service. They had failed to protect Kennedy. He was also fearful that there had been some kind of conspiracy and thought the Vietnamese were perhaps behind the killing of Kennedy because of Ziem's killing a month before. And he wanted Hoover to assure his safety. Now, is this a man who is involved in the killing of the president? How could it be? I mean, and Hoover is very responsive to him. They were old friends, you see. So I find in this just, there's no credible explanation.
Frank, let's, of course, fully agree with that, but let's deal with McClellan and Nigel Turner, the documentarian on this. Deal with their evidence.
The man who produced this documentary.
Their evidence, alleged or otherwise. I said that they have a lot of dead people that they're pointing fingers at. There are two live people that they mention. One is Billy Saul Estes. They never use him on camera. They never use him on camera. Of course, this Billy Saul Estes is the man at his sentencing told the federal judge, I don't know what is true. I live in a dream world. So he
not considered credible.
Well,
by you?
I think he's got a little weak case. Then, of course, there's Bobby Baker. Where is Bobby Baker in this film? Bobby Baker, it would seem to me, would be eager to salvage his reputation and so forth.
Billy Saul Estes is fascinating. I went back and pulled New York Times from March 24th, 1984. And there on page 9 of the New York Times was the following. Datelined Houston. Billy Saul Estes, the convicted confidence man who built Texas farmers out of millions of dollars in the 1960s, has told a county grand jury that Lyndon B. Johnson ordered the murder of a federal official to keep him from disclosing Johnson's purported involvement in that fraud. So Billy Saul Estes, we hear from periodically through the years making allegations against Lyndon Johnson. Have any of them borne fruit?
No.
Have any of them, have all of them been examined and looked into carefully?
There's also allegations from a woman named Madeline Brown, who claims she was Johnson's mistress and that she had a child by Johnson. The child and Madeline Brown sued the Johnson estate to get money for the alleged son. She never won that case. As far as I know, there was no successful lawsuit here.
This 1983-84 New York Times report you mentioned, I think this is the one that the FBI did look into the matter,
Yes.
and it came up empty.
They said that Billy Saul Estes is not a credible
No, well, that's right. The FBI,
informant.
that was their statement there.
Gentlemen, we're going to take a quick break. We'll come back. If all of this is true, as you say, why does this continue to endure? We'll talk about that. We'll also talk about the responsibility, as you raised, of the filmmaker here and the network that aired it right after this.
The Egyptian pyramids on Modern Marvels, tonight.
Welcome back to our discussion of a program that was televised last fall here on the History Channel. It put forth a controversial conspiracy theory that claimed that President Lyndon Baines Johnson was involved in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. In the interest of fairness and accuracy, this network has asked 3 independent historians to view the program and examine its allegations. They're with me in the studio. We've been discussing this program in particular. Let's now turn to the nature of the program, the sound of the program, and the responsibility of the program's producer in all of this. You all have looked at this, and you all have thought about this. Thomas Segrue, you want to lead the conversation?
Yes, I think that documentarians have a responsibility, if they're presenting controversial conspiracy theories, that can be done well in documentary, to present balanced evidence, to present evidence and counter evidence, to present both sides.
That was not done, you didn't feel, in this film?
No, it was all tending in one direction, one straight line, bringing in all sorts of circumstantial evidence, voices of alleged testimony from people who are long dead, and no credible counter witnesses, you could say. No one to shed questions, ask hard questions, to put some skepticism into the mix.
I think it's without evidence whatsoever. Look, this is sold as a documentary. Oliver Stone's movie JFK is sold as a movie. One of the great comic novelists of the late 20th century, Richard Condon, who wrote The Manchurian Candidate, wrote an uproarious book about Kennedy's assassination in which his father did it because the kid was becoming too liberal. Another famous novelist wrote this one about the Tears of Autumn, that the South Vietnamese did it. These are fiction. They're advertised as novels. We know that. They're for entertainment. Some may say they're cruel, they're sick, but they could be funny and they're entertaining. So everybody understands this. But this is sold as a documentary on, you ready? The History Channel.
All right, well, let's...
And that carries with it a certain import and a certain brand that gives it a cachet, a credibility, if you will, that is unique. And from that, I then say that the History Channel has a tremendous obligation to ascertain the credibility of what they are offering.
Yeah, I would echo what both Tom and Stanley is saying. After all, the History Channel has done some good work.
Absolutely.
They've put on some excellent programs. But this, it seems to me, was an act of great irresponsibility on their part. They say, well, this is just a theory we're presenting. Well, a theory should have some evidence, some basis in fact, should have some kind of balanced analysis. And this was lacking. And I think the irresponsibility of the History Channel, what they should understand is that when they do something like this, it creates a kind of cynicism in the country to suggest that a sitting vice president killed a president. Frank, if this had any glimmer of truth to it, I'd be the first to say, let's investigate, let's go forward, let's bring this out. But there is no evidence. And as a consequence, it just fans the flames of cynicism about the country's institution. And Lord knows, there's enough cynicism out there as it is.
And that's one of the reasons we're having this conversation now. Let me play devil's advocate, not devil's advocate exactly, but in a sense, for just a moment. Whether it's John Wilkes Booth and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, or Lee Harvey Oswald and the assassination of John F. Kennedy, we are fascinated by these things. We have a, as we discussed earlier, there is an almost cottage industry that looks into, is there more? You are all in the field of history. You don't stop looking because something happened a long time ago. So why not let 1,000 flowers bloom? Why not hear about all the different ideas and theories out there?
Well, history is more than just vain theorizing. That is, we rely on standards and evidence. Conspiracy theories fill in blanks. The evidentiary record is never perfect, and so where there's silence, we make noise when we present conspiracy theories, and they'll proliferate regardless of what we say or what we do, precisely because you can always come up with a creative new explanation resting on a shard of plausible history to make a counter-argument to what we know.
Pearl Harbor to this day it's brooded about that this was a conspiracy. There's a brilliant book written back in the 60s by Roberta Wohlstetter, Pearl Harbor, Warning and Decision. National failure to anticipate. She wrote a brilliant analysis of why we missed the attack at Pearl Harbor, why we were surprised. But this doesn't deter people from putting forth these conspiracy theories. Now, you know, there is no censorship in America. You can say anything you want, especially about history, and we'll continue to hear these theories. There was a wonderful essay by Richard Hofstadter, the great historian, who wrote an essay called The Paranoid Style in American Politics. It's part of the American character. It's part of our political calculation, one might say, part of our political tradition. It doesn't make it right, but it's there. We're not going to utterly or ever refute it. But our job is, as John Quincy Adams once said, the only religion the historian should have is the truth. Now, we know the truth is not, you know, so easy to come by. But nevertheless, this is what we strive to produce, something closer to the truth than these kinds of vacuous conspiracy theories.
This still begs the question of the History Channel's role. Yes, we have free speech and so forth, but you're talking about something, you're just voicing an opinion. Now, we got 1 billion opinions. Doesn't mean, hey, every one of them should be shown, should be offered as credible in any way. But there isn't, as I've said several times here today, there isn't a shred of evidence that this man advances in his own cause that could stand up to the scrutiny either of a historical methodology seminar or, if you will, a law court.
So what should be the standard? What should be the standard of what goes in a book, whether it's your book, on the television screen, or on the History Channel?
Well, this is what the History Channel has to think about now. They should set in place standards for reviewing the kinds of programs they're going to do in the future, instead of just falling into this kind of foolishness, as I see it, and putting forward this kind of vacuous documentary.
Well, I agree. I mean, you have a man who made assertion after assertion with not a shred of evidence. He included every possible source as a conspiracy theory. Very interesting sign of the times. He left out one person or one group that he didn't charge as being part of the conspiracy. What happened to the poor KGB and commies?
You're talking about when you say
he blames everybody. What happened to the poor commies? They're not here.
And it's worth pointing out, Thomas Segrue, that the producer of this program, Nigel Turner, has been in hot water with this series before when it aired in Great Britain.
Yes, when the series aired in Great Britain, an earlier episode made the assertion that 3 French criminals had been involved in the assassination of Kennedy. They were petty criminals. The French government quickly divulged records to show that they were nowhere near Texas at the time. It was yet another spurious documentary that was contributing to this real,
Gentlemen,
lack of standards.
we're going to take a quick break. I'm going to ask you to all hold your thoughts because I'm going to ask you for final thoughts in just a moment when we return. Welcome back. Last fall, the History Channel aired a series of independently produced programs that set forth various theories about the Kennedy assassination. After questions were raised about one of the programs, alleging that Lyndon Johnson was involved in the assassination, the History Channel asked these 3 independent historians to examine the program, give their opinions on its credibility, its accuracy. That's what we've been doing here this evening. And we're now going to close our conversation. Gentlemen, it is worth pointing out that one of the reasons this documentary aired, that 18% of the public believes that LBJ may have been involved, that the theories refuse to go away, is that LBJ and JFK both were iconic figures. They were larger-than-life characters of their age, and they continue to project that shadow, an imposing one, on the national screen. Johnson was a powerhouse politician from Texas. The fact is, Bob Dallek, that he didn't very much like being shoehorned into that role as vice president. And there wasn't the greatest of blood between Johnson and the Kennedys.
Well, you know, it was particularly between LBJ and Robert Kennedy.
Right.
JFK and LBJ got along pretty well. In fact, JFK kind of liked LBJ, and LBJ liked JFK, and JFK was mindful of the fact that Johnson was unhappy as vice president, so the bad blood between them wasn't nearly as bad, so to speak, as it was with Bobby. But you know, I think what continues to fan the flames of this conspiracy theory is that Johnson's image in history is not the most positive, and Kennedy is such an iconic figure. He has a hold on the world's imagination that people simply, he's, as Tom said at the beginning, it's tabula rasa. He's a blank slate. You can write anything on it that you want. And he has become our most inspirational president in modern history.
Kennedy's story is an unfinished story. And so much of the popular history of Kennedy is coming up with the ending, trying to figure out what may have happened. And we project onto that. And having a figure like Lyndon Johnson coming right on the heels of JFK, someone who did not have the iconic, reassuring, telegenic presence meant that the contrast seemed even starker and to many Americans even grimmer.
And what about this notion, too, Stanley Kutler, that LBJ was a ruthless politician, that in the 1948 election it was a stolen election? The documentary actually says that his career was built on bribery and corruption. But this image of Johnson, too, endures.
Sure, it's an image. He's not alone in having that kind of image. But you know, to go back to something we said before about this period of time, the assassination of Kennedy, Vietnam, Watergate, and there's a kind of cultural revolution in this country where there's a sea change in our attitudes toward government and so forth. And so many people still alive see the assassination of Kennedy as something that dramatically altered and transformed their lives. Well then, if you give them this convoluted yet simplistic theory of how and why it happened, they grab onto it.
I'd like to move you all to some final thoughts now. I'd like to let each of you sort of sum up your findings about the documentary and its impact on the public, its place in the discussion. But I'd also ask you to provide perhaps a bit of a guidepost for citizens, whether they consume their history on the silver screen, the big screen, on the television screen, or from a book. How does a citizen assure that the history that they're getting is good or accurate? How can you tell? You live in the documents. You live in the tapes. The rest, most of us do not. Tom Segrue.
Historians rely on evidence, on causality and evidence of causality, not simply coincidence. However, the silver screen can turn what are coincidences into seeming lines of causality. It's really important to know that the public trusts organizations like the History Channel. We trust that we're getting good history, but that trust should always have with it a degree of careful observation and skepticism. We should not allow circumstance and circumstantial evidence and coincidence to stand in for fact and causation.
Stanley Kutler.
About 70 years ago, a famous historian said, "Every man his own historian." Now more than ever, every man his own historian. Everybody fashions themselves as historian. He used to say, well, I read it in the newspaper, therefore it's true. Well, people don't read the newspaper anymore. They watch it on television. I saw it on television. It has to be true. What is to be done? Well, frankly, I despair of fighting this. You know, within the confines of my classroom, you know, I think I can effectively deal with it.
Yeah, you can assign me a tough paper.
Yeah, but in a mass market, these things will always be among us. And occasionally we get an opportunity such as this to say, no, it's wrong, it's corrupt, it's dishonest, it's deceitful, and which this film is in its entirety. Those opportunities are very, very rare. We're going to have more of this sort of thing, and as I say, we're going to perpetuate myths, misunderstandings, allegations, false, unreal, and so forth. So I have a certain amount of despair in me on that.
Robert Dallek, final word to you.
I'm more hopeful in the sense that, you know, we professional historians, if you produce an article that you send to a professional journal, it's refereed. Other experts will read it, will give the journal their opinion as to whether it's viable, persuasive, should be published. And I think the History Channel should do something similar. Because after all, the American Medical Association, orthopedic surgeons, cardiologists, neurosurgeons, they each have their organizations, they have standards, they certify expertise, and I think historians can do that too. I think the History Channel should have people in place who are going to make judgments and advise the History Channel. The History Channel has done some good work, very good work. They need to ask themselves, why is it we've done such good work and then we've done such terrible work in this particular documentary? And I think professional historians can help them. Look, nobody has a monopoly on truth, Frank. The great Dutch historian Peter Geel once said, history is an argument without end, and it always will be. But there are degrees and degrees, and there are standards that can be applied, and I think the History Channel should apply them.
And that's why we were here today, partly to have this conversation. On behalf of the History Channel, I'd like to thank our three historians for their time, their research, for your efforts, and for your careful reflection on the issues raised by the guilty men. This is Frank Sesno for the History Channel. Thanks for watching.